requests and very little praises, and sometimes even no praises. But today of all days, we have an equal number of praises as we do the prayer requests, and most of the prayer requests deal with the exact thing that we're addressing today. I think this is a good sign of the fact that we are ready to embark into this next step within the process. Over the past 7 months, even though a lot of you think that I'm just throwing things around randomly, Kayla, we've been going through a process. The past 7 months, we've gone through 4 different series to get us to this exact point. In January, we laid out a blueprint for a healthy church. We talked about the first love of the church, the love of God, the love of God Himself, then the love of God in us and the love of God coming out of us, and the first love of the church being the priority. And then we talked about the need for social justice and social reform and all these other things going on within the church. And then we talked about getting rid of all the church baggage and focusing back on that first love out of John 17. We talked about the need for the Holy Spirit to be within the church in Acts 2, and the gifts of the Spirit coming from that in Acts 12 through 14, but specifically, again, the agape love in 13. And we talked about the roles of the church and the people that are inside of it in 1 Timothy 3. And so we laid out a blueprint. Gotta love the dollar store. There we go. We've got a blueprint. We've got a framework. And then after that, we spent the Lent season focusing on our cornerstone. The stone that the builders rejected has become our cornerstone, Christ, the supremacy of Christ. And the supremacy of Christ over the church, and over religion, and over the patriarchs, and over time, and over culture, over worship, over death, and ultimately over life. And so once we figured out who this cornerstone is, we got our material together for the cornerstone, then we moved on into the next stage of getting the supplies ready to actually build the church itself. Evangelistic disciple making, where we talked about the difference between a devoted disciple and a day's decision. And we went through the 5 B's of belonging and believing and baptizing and then behavior and then becoming. And then we talked about the need for family discipleship. And then we talked about the need for the cost of discipleship. And so we got our materials ready, but before we could do anything with them, we had to lay our foundation. And we already talked about the fact that we have our cornerstone of Christ. But then we laid out the foundations of a healthy church, being the gospel, scripture, celebration, redemption, baptism, tithes and offerings, prayer, fellowship, and the Eucharist. And now that we've laid out the foundation and we have our materials together, the evangelistic disciple making, it's there. All that's left now is to build. We've got the framework. We've laid the foundation. We've established the supremacy of Christ as our cornerstone. We've gotten the tools together with the evangelistic disciple making. Now it's time to actually put them all together and build a healthy church. But any contractor that's actually worth paying will tell you, you don't just throw everything together once you have it. You have to have things laid out in order and everything planned together and another process going through. And so, we're going to go through this process the next 7 weeks until we hit the point where the building is actually up and established. Our healthy church is back and established. And we're going to do this by looking through the book of Nehemiah, the master builder Nehemiah in Scripture. But a little background before we get there. 700 BC, Hezekiah shows Jerusalem to the Babylonian envoy, which is it? Envoy? There we go. And he makes this statement, "At least there will be peace in my time." And because of that, in 650 BC, his son Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. And this is what it says the prophets told him. Since Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed all these detestable things, greater evil than the Amorites who preceded him had done. And by means of his idols he has caused Judah to sin. This is what the Lord God of Israel says: I am about to bring so much disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that everyone who hears about it will shudder. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line used on Samaria and the mason's level used on the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem clean as one wipes a bowl, wiping it in and turning it upside down. I will abandon the remnant of my inheritance and hand them over to their enemies. They will become plunder and spoil to all their enemies because they have done what is evil in my sight and have provoked me from the day their ancestors came out of Egypt until now. And so in 605 BC, we see this come about when Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, exiles Judah to Babylon. And we have the events that we're walking through on Wednesday night in the book of Daniel. That is until in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great invades Babylon. And then in 538 BC, Cyrus issues the decree of Ezra 1, 2, and 3 that says, this is what King Cyrus of Persia says: the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, in Judah. Whoever is among his people, may his God be with them, and may he go to Jerusalem and Judah and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And so many of the Jews return, but not Daniel, because he's not done yet. And for the first time in 70 years, they're able to start rebuilding and start trying to build God's kingdom back up in Jerusalem. That is until in 474 BC, Xerxes I issues a decree threatening all of the Jews living within the Persian Empire, threatening their execution. That is until his queen Esther, also known as Hadassah, calls the true intentions of Haman to Xerxes' attention and saves the entire people from genocide, and even allows for Mordecai the Jew to become second in command of the empire. And then, in 458, Ezra, high priest of Yahweh, the most educated person in the law in the entire kingdom, returns to Jerusalem to oversee the reestablishment of the covenant and the law and the rebuilding of the temple. And then in 445 BC, Nehemiah, son of Hilkiah, the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I, receives a message from Jerusalem. And that's where we're going to start in Nehemiah chapter 1. And this is what it says. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hilkiah. During the month of Chislev in the 20th year, when I was in the fortress city of Susa, and I, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah, and I questioned them about Jerusalem and the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. They said to me, the remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down, and its gates have been burned down. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept. I mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven, and I said, Yahweh, the God of heaven, the great and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keep his commands. Let your eyes be open and your ears be attentive to hear your servant's prayer that I now pray to you day and night. For your servants, the Israelites, I confess the sins we have committed against you. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted corruptly toward you and have not kept the commands, statutes, and ordinances you gave your servant Moses. Please remember what you commanded your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and carefully observe my commands, even though your exiles were banished to the ends of the earth, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I chose to have my name dwell. They are your servants and your people. You redeemed them by your great power and strong hand. Please, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to that of your servants who delight to revere your name. Give your servant success today and have compassion on him in the presence of this man. At that time I was the king's cupbearer. During the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence, so the king said to me, "Why are you sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but depression." I was overwhelmed with fear and replied to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" For 160 years, Jerusalem had laid in ruins. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin and a few remnants of the Levites lived under Babylonian and Persian rule. The other 10 tribes had basically already been wiped out by the Assyrians. They had survived the persecutions of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 3. They had survived the persecutions of Darius in Daniel chapter 6. They survived the persecutions of Haman in the entirety of the book of Esther. And now the high priest is back in Jerusalem for the first time. Ezra is back. He's there to share the word of the Lord and to reestablish the covenant and to rebuild the temple. The people are preparing restoration, and it was proven that God had indeed always provided them with a remnant. The covenant was going to be fulfilled. The covenants of Abraham, the covenants of Isaac, the covenants of Jacob, the covenants of David. All of these things were going to come back together, and everyone should be happy. But they said to me, the remnant of the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down, and its gates have been burned to the ground. And immediately we see Nehemiah respond by fasting and praying. And this prayer is not your typical prayer. It's very confusing. It's a very good example of an actual prayer of prayers, like we talked about when we talked about the foundation of prayer. It's very worshipful in the way that it's presented. It says, "Yahweh, God of heaven, great awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keep his commands. Let your eyes be open and your ears be attentive to hear your servant's prayer that I pray to you day and night. I confess the sins we have committed against you, my sins and my father's. They are your servants. They are your people. You redeemed them by your great power and strong hand. Please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and that your servant reveres your name." It's a very good example of a prayer of prayer. That's a good thing about it. It's also a very good example of an intercessory prayer. It says, "Let your eyes be open, your ears be attentive to hear your servant's prayer that I now pray to you day and night. The Israelites, I confess the sins we have committed against you. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We've acted corruptively toward you. We've not kept your commandments, statutes, and ordinances you gave us. We were unfaithful, but we are returning to you, so please return back to us." He was interceding on behalf of his people. But it is a horrible, horrible example of a prayer petition. What was he actually praying for? What's he actually praying for? Does anybody actually know what he's praying for about himself? Because this is a prayer for himself. It's not actually meant to be an intercessory prayer. It's a prayer for himself. He's making a petition to God. But out of everything we read, does anything sound like he's actually making a petition? No. It's a horrible example of a prayer petition, but yet that's exactly what it is. Because this is what he says in verse 11. Please, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to that of your servants who delight to revere your name. And this is his petition. Give your servant success today. Have compassion on him in the presence of this man. Because at that time, I was the king's cupbearer. He's asking for God, first of all, to hear his prayer, the intercession and the prayer that came before. Hear that so that way you will honor my petition to give me success and compassion in the presence of the king. And this is because Nehemiah already had a plan in place. He already had his blueprint ready to go. He knew exactly what he was going to do because he saw an opportunity. He was the king's cupbearer. He was guaranteed day in and day out to have at least 3 times of presence before the king uninterrupted. Because we saw in Esther, you can't just walk in and talk to the king of kings of Persia. If you walk in uninvited, off with your head. And even though he's got a presence with the king, he still has to ask God, give me compassion and give me success. Because if Nehemiah makes a request to him and the king doesn't like it, it's still off with your head. But Nehemiah saw the opportunity and he knew his plan. And this is what we see in verses 1 through 3, that it takes him 4 months for it to actually show up. Because the month of Chislev in the first verse would be about November, December. And then the month of, where'd it go? Because I'm not going to say it right. Nisan, there we go. Month of Nisan is about April. And it says that both of them were within the 20th year of Artaxerxes. So, from December to April, Nehemiah has been praying, give me success today and give me compassion, because I have this plan, I know what I'm supposed to do, and so I'm going to do it. But what does this actually show us? The first thing it shows us that prayer is a requirement. We already kind of addressed this back when we talked about the foundation of prayer, but you cannot do anything planning without prayer being there. It's not just a necessity, it's a requirement. Just like we saw with Jesus going into the desert, we saw Moses going to the mountain, we saw the disciples in Jerusalem. Nehemiah knows prayer is a requirement before he does anything. Because if the mission you are on is not bathed in prayer, it's not worth pursuing. If you have not prayed through every single step of what you are going to do, it is not worth pursuing if you are talking ministry. It's a requirement, not just something that's helpful. The second thing we see is that Nehemiah knew his calling. That's why the prayer petition was so hard to figure out. He wasn't asking for God to show him what to do. He knew what he was going to do. He knew his calling. Nehemiah saw that, like Esther 20 years earlier, God had placed him in this position, king's cupbearer, for such a time as this. For a specific purpose. He and he alone was guaranteed an audience every single day with the king. And he alone knew the status of what was going on in Jerusalem. And he knew that God had chosen him to make the request of financing and authorizing the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And he also knew that if he made that request after having been bathed in prayer, that it would be granted. Nehemiah knew his calling. But the third thing we see of this is that Nehemiah also was patient. It took him 4 months to finally ask the question in chapter 2. If Nehemiah had gone immediately to the king and said, hey, give us the stuff. This is what God's telling me to do, so give it to me. It would not have worked out. At that point now, the king's servant is now demanding the king and telling the king what to do and when to do it. Even if God's the one that told Nehemiah to do it, this is how it's going to look to the King of Kings. This exile is trying to tell me how to run my kingdom. That is not going to turn out very well. But instead, Nehemiah prays, give me success, let me know when it's time, and then I will do it. And so what we see in chapter 2 is now the king asks Nehemiah what the king can do. You've never been sad in my presence, and now you are always sad. This can't be anything but depression. What can I, the king, do to help you, my servant? And so now Nehemiah knows he has his opportunity. He knew that at that exact moment, God had opened the door. And the fourth thing, and this is the thing we're going to focus on for the rest of today. Nehemiah saw the hurt of his people, and it affected him. This last little thing is the one thing we're going to spend the rest of today focusing on. The news of the destruction in the city and the hurting of the people caused Nehemiah to immediately weep, to immediately drop down in mourning. He fasted and he prayed for 4 months that God would provide him an opportunity to be able to minister back to his people. And it affected him so severely that the depression got bad enough that the king took notice of a servant's depression. It ripped him apart to hear the reports coming back from Jerusalem. And so this is the question that we're going to ask. And we've got a little video here to start with. But do we have the same reaction? No, go back and hit play. Down in the corner. Yeah, there it is.
Cloaked in the disguise, signing dotted line and social. I told them, find another ride, cause this roller coaster's stolen. Going to a fate you won't believe, focus, focus. Throwing drinks in the fixes, eats till the woken. Growing them seeds, that's all the seeds that have roses. Works and reason he did it. Death is sparked, the throne is born on souls for attention. All to be heard, if the only honorable one. But listen, each of the words, lot of research going from a home that they dig it. Got to be words, strong for him to take on the mission. I don't want nobody captain them bluffing buses I finished. Just pinning picture and mentions what say don't want to do it. Do with the vision of slaves, let you pretend to keep it. See the bus, get in the back and act like it's proven that I can do it. So actually lacking the black communion, proof of lacking the facts, lacking the status for us, the best rapping the master, the master rapping the nuisance. That they have for lacking that happy daddy influence, that gratitude to the back and the crack with the back of children. They itch the back, but they back with the back of task and Judas. That is the reaction, I accept the master Jewish. That is the reaction, I accept the master Jewish. The back was a little faster, that's the actions of Judas, go forward a little more. That's the master Jewish, they rise to the master Judas. So that's the attitude that they have, that's the pursuit of got the actual fruit. It ain't over to the fact that they say he's gonna grab a fruit sack. Playing the soundtrack, the game singing the blues. How did they remind the same came and listen to? A double one generation, not how you kind of rebuke. Divided inside of you, kind of try to remind you. Only one thing is true, tell me what you gon' do. Money is at the root when they come, none of you.
Do we have the same reaction when we hear the news and stats of life within both Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, and specifically also within West Park? In addition to those stats, Cleveland is number 7 on the list of top 100 least safe cities for populations over 50,000. We are number 9 on the list of top 101 cities with the highest CityData.com crime index. The crime rating score is 98.8% higher than the U.S. average. The violent crime rate is 4 times higher than the U.S. average. The property crime rate is 3 times higher than the U.S. average. We're also number 4 on the list of top 101 cities with the highest number of robberies per 100,000 residents. Number 8 for burglaries. Number 16 for rape. Number 20 for arson. Number 24 for auto theft. Number 25 for murder. We are number 11 on the list of top 101 cities with the highest percentage of single-parent households. The median household income for the city is 48% below the state average. 36% of city residents are at or under the poverty level. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there were 227,740 people living in poverty within Cuyahoga County, which represents 18% of the county. 52% Black, 33% White, 8% Latino, 2% Asian. There's an estimated 23,000 people, which is around 10% of those living in poverty, who experience homelessness every year within the county. The Cleveland public school system saw 2,744 homeless students in 2017. There has been an increase to a crisis level in family homelessness to 2,154 in 2017. That's a 24% increase in 2 years. According to the Office of Homeless Services, the number of people in shelters has increased from 4,576 to 4,698 in 1 year. There's an estimated 51% of children under the age of 18 within Cuyahoga County are below the poverty line. 4,921 abortions within Cuyahoga County in 2016. That's 35% of the state of Ohio's. The Cleveland public school system is ranked 602 of the 608 school districts within Ohio by the Ohio Department of Education. It was given an overall rating of F. Every single individual category was given an F as well, except for K through 3rd grade literacy, which only received a C-. Within Cleveland, only 78% of people have a high school diploma, only 18% have a college degree. 47% of the county claim to be a part of the non-religious group. But that's with us being number 5 on the list of top 101 counties with the most Orthodox congregations, number 9 for Catholic congregations, number 9 for Orthodox adherents, number 10 for most Black Protestant congregations, number 11 for most mainline Protestant congregations, and number 65 for most Evangelical Protestant congregations. And then in the news, we see the realities that these sort of things can't even go to. Human trafficking. The biggest reality is the fact that Ohio is ranked 4th in the country for human trafficking, and has one of the most famous stories of human trafficking with Castro. The heroin epidemic. Ohio is the center point for the heroin epidemic within this country. The deadliest overdose here in Cuyahoga County history was last year, but according to Sergeant Ivy at the 1st District Police Department over here, every day they receive at least 2 calls for an overdose. Gun violence. There was just another shooting Friday night. Racism, financial discrimination. This is the city of Tamir Rice. But this is also the city where in the past 3 months there have been 2 officers that have had to be buried as well. Threats to our schools. You go one more. Parma was shut down for almost 3 days. In addition to that, we have threats of terrorism within this community because we are a bigger city. 2 bombings within bomb threats within the past 2 years just on the west side of Cleveland, not even counting the other threats going on within the school. And so the questions are, if these do not rip you apart the way it did Nehemiah, we have to ask you why. If these don't drive you to prayer in the same way it does Nehemiah, we have to ask you why. If these don't make you ask why God has placed you in this specific setting for such a time as this, we have to ask the question of why. If these don't drive you to seek out your calling in the same way it did Nehemiah, we have to ask why. And if these don't make you want to have real, effective gospel ministry infiltrate the city and the county in the same way that it does Nehemiah, we have to ask the question, why? Why are we okay with the reality that kids are having to walk around the streets having to decide between carrying a weapon or being jumped? Because Micah last night actually had to stop a kid from getting beat up just over here on the other side of the fence. Kids having to know where to go once school is out instead are drawn into the gangs or the drug houses or by the human traffickers and sexual predators. Parents having to worry about whether dropping their children off at school is safe or not. Teachers at these schools having to supply their classrooms out of their own pockets when they're barely getting paid anyway, with the hope that the 70% of the kids that will actually graduate will be able to learn something out of the joke of curriculum that the state has given them. The reality that the majority of those kids that are not going to graduate are going to end up in jail, prison, or in the ground before they turn 18. And that those that do graduate are going to end up with at least $20,000 in student debt if they can even get into college. And that then even with their degree, it's going to be hard-pressed for them to find a job, because the reality is that the rate of unemployment for 25-plus-year-olds with the degree in Cuyahoga County is 13%. The reality that the District 1 officers are daily dealing with at least one suicide and overdose a day. The reality that only 10 cities in the country have a higher rate of single-parent households than we do. That the homeless in our communities have no real options to go to for help or even for shelter. That 407,474 county residents have had to receive county welfare in 2017. And that last year alone, 523 Cuyahoga County babies were already born addicted to drugs. That last year, 2,147 kids were placed in DCS custody. And the bigger one, that half of the population of our county claim no religious affiliation or belief, and those are the ones that actually admit it. We cannot be okay with this. Our city is hurting, and the only solution is our cornerstone. We have to be mission-focused as a fellowship of believers and be actively evangelizing and discipling within West Park and within Cleveland and within Cuyahoga County and within Ohio and within the Midwest and within the country. And so this is how we're going to finish this off. We have to evaluate ourselves as the workers. Are we okay with the situation that we have here in West Park and within Cleveland? If that you answer that question with the no, then the next step is to pray for God to give you the direction as to what your role actually is. What's your calling? Why are you in the position you are in financially or career-wise or just within this church? And then ask, when is it your time to act? Maybe your answer is no, now that I know what is actually going on. And if that's you, then the questions that you have to pray about and ask God to show you is, why was I unaware so long? What was it that was keeping me from knowing what was going on with my neighbors around me? Was it pride? Was it ignorance? Was it your social status? Was it your circle of friends? What is it that has kept you from knowing what's been going on within West Park and within Cleveland? And once God has identified that with you, just like Nehemiah, we have to pray for forgiveness and redemption out of that, and then ask God what the next step is for you to be able to move forward and to do something about it. But if you answered the question, yes, I'm okay with the way things are in the community, then the question we have to ask you is, why are you even here? Because if the answer is yes, then you are not focused on the cornerstone. We talked about that in the blueprint. You are not defined by agape love. You are not practicing evangelistic disciple making. You are not a healthy member of the fellowship of believers, because if you are not driven to action by the stats of the fallen world around you, then you have no vision for the mission of this church. To say that the status quo is okay is to be just like what Jesus described the goats in Matthew 25 as, where he says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." So if you answer the question of, yes, I'm okay with the way things are today in this community, then the first step is for you to pray that God open your eyes and that they be aligned with Christ. And then ask, God, why is it that I have been unaware so long and unwilling to be aware? And then ask God, what is my purpose in doing this? And then ask God to show you what direction to go next. Or if you are confident then that there is nothing that needs to be done, then I'm going to be straight up. You need to ask yourself the question, is it even worth you attending here? Because you are not going to enjoy the benefits of fellowship. Because you are not going to be a part of the vision. And you are going to be a hindrance to the fellowship, because you are not going to be pushing us forward. You are going to be dragging us back. Our community and our city needs us to be the hands and feet of Christ, not just a building on the corner. We have to be mission and discipleship driven this point forward. We have the blueprint. We know our cornerstone. We've laid the foundation. We have the material ready to go. And so from this point forward, we have to be evangelism and discipleship driven. Just like Nehemiah, we cannot sit outside of the situation and continue on like everything else is fine, because we're the cupbearer to the king. And we can just sit here and enjoy the palace. We need to have our spirits broken for the community that we're placed in, and pray for personal and corporate direction as to what God's going to have us do. And so this is how we're going to close. We're not going to sing a song. We're not going to have I hate altar calls, because it just feels awkward most of the time. You can come up here if you want. You can stay there. But before you leave, I want you to seriously pray and ask God, why are we here? If you answered the question of, is this stuff okay? Are we okay with this? With a no, then start asking the question, why did it take me so long to understand what's going on? And ask God to work on that area before He shows you the next step. Or maybe it's time for Him to show you the next step. If you answered the question with yes, then you need to be praying and asking God, why am I answering yes? And should I actually even be here? You can say as long as you'd like, you can say as short as you'd like. But that's how we're going to close today out, is just in this idea of we need to be praying corporately and individually as to where we are going.